Kathy and I were married in July in Moncton, New Brunswick, and then we slowly left for my first pastoral charge in Newfoundland, which was a 5 churches sort of on the coast of Newfoundland, just 60 kilometers north of Gander, which in the 1980s was a fairly isolated part of the country, and this was before internet and beta movies and cable and all of those good things. I think we used to get CBC on black and white, and we spent our mornings listening to Morningside, which kind of felt like it kept us connected with the world. And we were there for 3 years, and when I first arrived, there was this pile of baptismal requests on my desk, and you know, I'd kind of grown up in the post-Christian, post-world of not everybody gets their child baptized anymore as an infant, and I couldn't figure out what this was all about until somebody said to me, well, if you don't baptize my child is not registered with the government as being born. I need you to fill out a birth certificate, but you can't do that until the child is baptized. Now that probably goes way, way back in Canadian history to a time when the government did not regulate or control our lives as much as it did, and I soon discovered that I would get called upon to baptize every child in those 5-point pastoral charge so they could have a birth certificate. People would come to me with their old tattered marriage certificates, and they'd even come with their family Bible. And I would have to witness that their birth had been written in the family Bible so we could prove that they were 65 and they could get their old age pension. So it was kind of a time when the church played an interesting role in the people's lives. And of course, I had lots of conversations then about, you know, baptism and what it means, because being kind of young and earnest and newly ordained, I felt some responsibility that the sacrament of baptism, because it is one of our 2 sacraments, had a little bit more integrity than just a birth certificate. So I'd had lots of conversations about why would you have your child baptized, except apart from registering them with the government. And of course, they were interesting conversations, like why do we baptize children? Some people felt it was a kind of life insurance. Some people were afraid that if their child wasn't baptized, that if it died young, God might turn its back on them. Some people felt that it was a necessary and important ritual. Some people felt that primal urge that we often do when a child is born to do something that is holy and ritualistic within a community of people that we are a part of. There was many a young man and a young woman that said, you know, if we don't get this kid, I'm part Newfoundlander, so I can kind of enjoy the language. If we don't get this kid done, you know, my grandma's going to give me hell when I go back to Carmenville or back to Main Point or wherever we were going. And but it is certainly less so in a post-Christian time when the culture doesn't prop us up as much. So, you know, culture used to prop the church up in its mission. Well, if everybody had to have a birth certificate to be baptized, well, then, you know, we had lots of infant baptisms. And if there was nothing else to do on a Sunday and everything was closed, it was, church was an opportunity to be in community and to come together. And there's a debate that's raged in the Christian church for many years. It goes off and on about what we call infant baptism and the practice of confirmation. So baptizing is baptizing an infant, and then asking someone to make the promises to raise them within the Christian community. It's not just to bring them to church, but it's to raise them exposed to the Christian faith, versus what we sometimes do as the Anabaptist tradition, to wait until you're an adult, because in that part of the church, people believe that it's important to be able to make an informed choice about what it is you believe and what you want to commit your life to. So there's questions that rage back and forth on that debate. I'm not going to go into it. Some of them are good. I think some of them are not so good. But the tradition of baptism is actually also pre-Christian. So there's all kinds of pre-Christian societies that had rituals and ceremonies that involved water, because water is used for cleansing, water is used to sustain life. A child is conceived and held in the birth waters and nurtured and grown to bless people, to cleanse people, and to welcome people into the community. And the Jewish faith, like many other religions, has a place and an understanding of water. They had a ritual for cleansing, and the Bible tells us that Jesus was baptized because John was in the wilderness baptizing people who were repenting of their sins, and the gospel writers tell us that Jesus had an experience that informs what Christian baptism is all about. That not only was there water, but there was the voice of God, there was the descent of the Holy Spirit, and that forms the symbolic nature of, in the United Church, either adult baptism and confirmation, or infant baptism and then confirmation sometime later on. In the early church, we do have evidence of household baptisms, and that would be not uncommon in times in Western culture and in other cultures where people were not so individualistically oriented, where people did what the community leader did. So if the community leader decided, or the family leader, that he or she were going to be Christians, then everybody, including all the little people, got baptized and became Christians at the same time. I like infant baptism a lot for a couple reasons. So baptism kind of stands on its own. I'm going to talk a bit about that. But I just want to say that it's kind of upheld by these three sets of promises that get made. The first promise is God's promise. It's the promise of grace. It's the promise that predates creation. It's the promise that God loves humanity and all people equally, and that God created out of love, and God never takes that love away. And we can't put conditions on it. You've heard me say this before: the unconditional grace and love of God is not fully grace if we put a but on it, or an and on it, or an if on it. So it's this horrible thing that happens in our society. It happens a lot to people that don't quite fit in. It's, when someone who's a Christian says, well, I really love you, even though you're, gay, lesbian, transgendered, but, or we say to someone, well, we love you, but we don't love the sin. Well, that's kind of putting a but and an if and an and on it for God, and that's not how God works. Richard Rohr says God's only job is to give God away, to give love away. So that's the first promise that upholds this whole experience. The second is the promise that family members take to be a part of sharing the Christian faith with their child. Now, Michelle was really nervous this morning, and so she sort of texted me and wanted to maybe pass on making the remarks. And I think I gave you the free choice to do that, because I don't want to be a bully. But I wanted Michelle to do that and to share that with you because it's such a beautiful model of what it means as a family to take responsibility for exposing yourself and your children to the Christian faith. It's a funny thing. Lots of times over my years in ministry, people will say, well, yeah, but we don't want to expose our kids to religion because we want them to make their own choice. And, I won't recount the conversations I have about that, but when you think about it, it's kind of a strange thing. We expose our children to all kinds of things and teach them about it. And we know that they'll never kind of, if they want to kind of master something, then they're going to have to practice it. So, baseball, soccer, we make all kinds of decisions for our children, how much time they're going to spend on the internet, how much time they're going to have a cell phone. Why, in this incredibly complex world, would we think that we could just abandon a child to make whatever choice they want to make in terms of religion, especially when we know there's so much bad religion around? I mean, that's how people get involved in cults. So Michelle modeled for us very beautifully this morning the intentionality of helping someone in her care and her responsibility learn and grow about the Christian faith. And then, of course, the third promise is the congregations. I don't know how you folks feel in the church when you make that promise, whether you feel it's kind of an empty promise, or you sort of sit and think, okay, like what can I do as a person who's part of this body of faith to help Isabelle understand the love of God, help Isabelle grow in the love of God? But your role is important. And it was illustrated to me some years ago by hearing Will Williman, who was he's now the retired chaplain of Duke University, talk about the importance of honoring baptismal promises. And he told this story of being in his university chaplain's office, and it was graduation day, and this set of parents just kind of stormed into his office, right past the secretary, put their hands on his desk, and started yelling at them that he had ruined their child's life. Now, he was kind of taken back by that, and he didn't even know who they were, so he said, oh. So he kind of got them calmed down, and they sat down, and he said, well, what do you mean that I ruined your child's life? And they said, well, we had a plan for our son. Our son was going to graduate from university. He was going to become a lawyer. He was going to join a big firm. He was going to make a lot of money. He was going to get married. He was going to have children. And he was going to live near us, and we were going to have grandchildren. And Will Williman looked and said, well, what's changed? He said, well, you told my child about Jesus, and now he wants to go to Africa and be a doctor. You've ruined his life. Well, it's a risky thing to give your life to Christ. It's a risky thing to give your life to God, because it means that what you may want to do or have chosen to do or are comfortable to do gets changed along the way. And it may get changed to have something to do that's risky, that requires you to give of yourself in a way that you'd never thought of. There's another reason I like infant baptism. We take this little child that, of course, is adorable and cute, and will be adorable and cute for all of her life. Right? We take the child before we know anything about her, really. We take a child before any system in the world has got too much of a hold on her life. So before the voices of the world in which we live in say, you know, Isabelle, your role in life is to be a consumer. We want to sell you all these things that you don't need. Or, you know, Isabelle, be an individual. You don't need anybody else in life. Just, you know, do your own thing. It's all about you. Before people get a grip and she enters that world where someone says, you know what, if you take this drug, if you shoot this in your veins, you're going to be happy. So we take a child before they go to school, before they begin to formulate a character, before the first power struggles come in the family, before we have to let her go into the world and struggle with that thing that all parents do and let them make choices. And before any of those things happen, we say, Isabelle, you are a child beloved of God. You're created in the image of a loving God. You have this identity that no one can take away, that nothing can change. Doesn't matter the choices you make. We want you to make good ones, but that will never be gone. Now, you say, why is that important? Well, let me share with you why it's important. Because I got a call last Saturday from a guy that I deployed with in the Army in 2008 to Afghanistan. He's now a Vancouver firefighter. I can tell you this, it's all in the public realm. Jay called me and he said, Jim, remember when we were together doing the Veterans Transition program and I told you about my sister Sarah? And I said, yep, she was having a really, really tough time. He said, well, Sarah's taken her life. She was in Alberta. She had a long history with alcohol and drug abuse. And as often happens with people who take their life when there is alcohol or drug dependence and perhaps depression, she must have just found herself in a really dark place. And probably more so than taking an action, she reacted to how hopeless she was feeling, and she took her life. And Jay said, my family and I, we don't even know what to do, Jim. We don't even know what to say. So we all got together. And of course, the problem is that those of us that haven't had some of those struggles, we tend to look at people and define them by their actions and their choices. So the question whenever we have a memorial service for someone who takes their life is, like, who are they? Like, everybody's there thinking they took their life, and everybody knows that Sarah had a 15-year struggle with drugs and violence. And I found myself saying, well, there's two things we have to do. Well, three things, but the two things that relate to what I'm saying is the first thing is that we have to point out to everybody that Sarah is not defined by the way she chose to take her life. And Sarah is not defined by her struggle with alcohol, drugs, and violence. So those are the negatives. She's not defined by that. She is defined by being a child of God. You see, that's the baptismal message. And so that's what we said yesterday, amongst other things. They were very honest and open about what happened. We had 150 people there. Many of them were young first responders and military people. So we talked about suicide. And we talked about how to be helpful in those situations. But we also clearly said, Sarah is not defined by her death. the method of her death. She's not defined by her addiction. She was, and always will be a beloved child of God. And that's what I love about baptism. Because if we can kind of burn that into our hearts, then it becomes easier for us as adults when we look at people we don't like. And we go, man, I can't stand that person. That person's a child of God. I don't agree with that person politically. That person's a child of God. Jim, I am so frustrated by what my child is doing. I feel like I've lost all my hopes for them. Yes, and your child is still a child of God. I don't like that person, Jim, that's got a different skin color than me or a different religion. Jesus said, even if I don't like my enemy, they are still children of God. And to do that radically begins to change the nature of our relationships and our world. And that's why I love the sacrament of infant baptism. It's not about the promises. People keep them, they don't keep them. Churches change. But we say to that child, and if all we do to the children that we are involved with is to continually remind them that they are beloved children of God, that is almost enough. Amen.